There is a famous, very well-known science fiction work from the early 1950s, written by Ray Bradbury, called Fahrenheit 451. And in that novel, it's a dystopian future world where all books are banned. You're not allowed to read. And by the end of the novel, the main character has sort of escaped and run off with a group of people, sort of intellectual hippies, who have each memorized a book. And they are going to keep that, they've preserved that knowledge of that literature for a better future, hopefully. So let's imagine that scenario, okay? Imagine you're in that scenario, but instead of having a work of literature like, the Odyssey to remember, say that you're in charge of the Spider-Man tradition. You are the person that has to remember the Spider-Man story and transmit it to the next generation. What are you going to transmit? Are you going to draw on just the comic books? Are you going to include all the movies? Which movies? Is every Spider-Man legitimate? Are you going to include Into the Spider-Verse and all those variations? What sources are you going to include? What about fan fiction? Does that count? So, imagine that's a difficult proposition, right? You're in charge of maintaining Spider-Man. So that's kind of like what I deal with in my work with the Homeric epics, because it's not a single text. And so that's what I have prepared to talk to you about today. It's basically a product, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the ancient Greek epics that have come down to us, are the product of an oral tradition, very long-standing oral tradition that might go back, it certainly goes back thousands of years, but probably to the Bronze Age and earlier, they were telling epics like our Iliad and Odyssey. And they come down to us in a variety of media. So I'm just going to briefly go through a few slides that kind of illustrate that and show you the complexity of trying to transmit the Homeric Iliad and Odyssey to modern times. This is a fresco from the walls of a Bronze Age palace in Pylos. And you see on it a performer with a lyre performing some kind of song. I'm arguing it's an epic song. And the song is visualized, if you can see this far, for those of you in the back, the song is visualized as a bird in flight. And what has always intrigued me about this fresco is that one of the most common phrases that you find in the Homeric Iliad and Odyssey, and of course, any of you who have read any of the Iliad and Odyssey will remember that there's all sorts of formulaic phrases that are repeated over and over again. And one of them is such and such spoke winged words. And when you read that, you probably wonder, what is winged words? What does that mean? And what I'm trying to show you here is that winged words may be performed words that are part of an epic song tradition that have been being performed, again, thousands of years, but it's certainly not something that's written down, right? So when the stories about Achilles in the Trojan War, about the Odysseus trying to get home from the Trojan War, when those were first known to people, they were known as part of a song tradition. And it's a traditional song tradition where everybody would have known the stories. Nothing would have been a shock to them, but it was certainly one that only came to life in performance. And so no two songs was ever exactly the same, even if they were very traditional in content. So my work over the past 20 years at the University of Houston, a part of it has always been working on this project called the Homer Multitext. It's very easy to remember the URL. It's www.homermultitext.org, where we are trying to create an edition of the Homeric Iliad, and maybe one day we'll get to the Odyssey, who knows, but we've already been doing the Iliad more than 20 years. We want to make an edition of the Iliad that is true to the fact that this is from an oral tradition. So we want to publish as many of the historic instantiations of the text as possible. So what I mean by that is all the manuscripts. Now, we won't be able to publish all of them, but we're publishing the oldest and most important manuscripts that have come down of the Iliad. We also publish some texts on papyrus, which I'll show you in a minute, and we look at texts that quote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And when you look at all these texts together, one thing that you figure out pretty quickly is that they don't always match up exactly, which they shouldn't, because they're part of an oral tradition. But the cool thing is that the older the text you're looking at, the further you go back in time, the more what we call multiform they are. Multiform being the word for being like that they're not all the same. They're not all exactly the same. Now, these are not shocking differences. This isn't like, Achilles doesn't die at Troy kind of differences. But there are variations in the text, significant variations, fewer lines, more lines, an episode is not included. There are manuscripts where the whole Shield of Achilles is not included, or the catalog of ships. So there's just different ways of telling the tale and putting it together. And on this slide, the reason why I've included the picture of the performer there is that a huge inspiration for my project is the work of Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who are two scholars who went to was called back then Yugoslavia in the 1930s, and they recorded on by dictation and through these kind of things. They're sort of like our records, our vinyl records, but they're on aluminum discs, and other kinds of recording equipment that was available back then. And they recorded the South Slavic epic tradition, and they compared it by analogy to the Homeric tradition and figured out sort of how the Homeric tradition must have worked by observing these South Slavic singers. And so on the slide, I have an image of Avdo Majadovic, who is one of the performers that they recorded multiple times over the years, and who they were very impressed by because he could sing a song as long as our Odyssey. So this is just Milman Parry with a couple of the performers that they recorded. Here's an image of the equipment that they used. And you can see that the man in the chair is holding the musical instrument that the performers in this tradition used in Yugoslavia, the gusle. And this is Avdo performing. And I'll tell you why I wanted you to hear it. They took that video in the 1930s, so that was pretty advanced technology at the time, and they actually recorded the video and audio separately and had to put it together later. But the reason why I wanted to show you that is that Avdo was performing a song. At that moment, he was singing about, I think, a wedding and people showing up at the wedding and things like that. And he wasn't, singing a verse and then thinking about it for a little while, and then singing another verse. He was just going one after the other, right? It was very quick. You could maybe, if you were listening carefully, kind of hear how there was a musicality, a rhythm, a meter that he was performing with. But the thing that makes that possible is not actually memorization. It's a highly traditional diction that they're putting together the phrases almost like we put together words in our language. And they're able to do that because they've become fluent in the language of oral epic poetry. And they've been apprenticed to their uncle or their father, or they've learned the skill and they've learned the language of their traditional poetry, and they can call those phrases and lines and verses and speeches and things like that together like vocabulary and tell a story. So how do you go from a tradition like that? The reason, Milman Parry and Albert Lord wanted to figure out, how can you compose an epic like our Iliad and Odyssey orally when you don't have writing, right? And then how does it get transmitted? And so they were able to study this modern oral tradition to much better understand how the ancient one must have worked. But then we have to go from that, right? When that oral tradition dies out, how do we get to text? And how do we get to the text we now have? So the very earliest texts we have of the Iliad and Odyssey survive on this thing called papyrus. It's sort of like a very cottony paper, almost. It's almost like cloth, but it's made out of plants. It's made out of the papyrus plant. Very labor-intensive and expensive to make. And so we have fragments of the Iliad and Odyssey on papyrus. As you can see, there are a lot of holes. The earliest papyrus texts come from the 200s BC. Okay, so the 200s BC, which is much, much later than that fresco I showed you, 1,000 years later than that fresco I showed you of the singer. But those are our earliest texts, and they're not complete. But when we look at them, we can see that they varied a lot. Again, because they're part of an oral tradition, they vary from one another. They have a lot of what we call multiformity. So the texts were on papyrus like this, again, very fragmentary, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it wasn't until medieval times, basically, that we start to get texts on animal skin, parchment. And those are the manuscripts that you may be more familiar with. So this one that I have on the screen here, and you can look it up or see more later on homermultitext.org, but this one is from the 900s CE, and it's our oldest, actually, complete text of the Iliad. But of course, when I say complete, you might be wondering, just going back to my Spider-Man analogy, what is a complete Iliad, right? Because there shouldn't be just one Iliad, but this is one that has a first line and a last line. Okay, how about that? And it's a super deluxe manuscript. It's our earliest one, but it's also our most deluxe one. And I'm going to show you how it has writing all over it. Like it has a text of the poem, sing goddess the wrath of Achilles, all of that. And then it has all kinds of writing in the margins and between the lines and all over the place. And these are commentary, like ancient scholarly commentary on the text. Sometimes they're talking about the meaning of words or mythological backstory, people's origin stories for the heroes. But they also talk about other versions of the text that they are familiar with, and that's all included in this incredible manuscript. So I know this is going to be hard to see for some of you, so I'm just going to go through this very quickly so you can just kind of see a few, what the manuscript looks like and where the writing is and all of that. This one's kind of a dorky slide, but I have to show it. That's the main text. And then all of this is commentary. Okay, yeah. So here's the thing, though. Even these manuscripts, which seem like indestructible, are fading. And you can see this especially in just one example. In the top right corner of the first main page of text of the Iliad in this incredible manuscript, there is a drawing of a harp, or like a lyre, really. And in it, there was commentary that in 2007, when these photographs were taken, you couldn't really see anymore. In 1901, there were some photographs that were taken right here. And in 1901, you could see that there was writing, but you couldn't really read it in the photographs because the photography back then wasn't high enough resolution, right? So it photographed it, you could see it was there. So between 1901 and 2007, the text had faded a lot. But we were able to use UV light and get back most of the text in the 2007 photography. But it just shows you that, again, even these manuscripts, we have to preserve and do a lot of special things with technology to try to keep them, for another generation. Oh, this is just a zoom up. Okay, so the Iliad has come down to us in the form of papyrus texts that are very fragmentary, eventually medieval manuscripts, and then we have to make a text, right, that you can buy in a bookstore, like a Greek text. But here, the problem is, what text do you choose when you have a lot of multiformity between the manuscripts, and there really shouldn't be one text, right? There shouldn't be one text of an oral tradition. So what do you do? Well, that is a huge problem for my field, and it's just something to think about. But whenever you make a single printed text of the Iliad, you are discounting a lot of other potential texts, right? And you can have a little thing at the bottom of the page where you record the variants, but that kind of still privileges one over the other. And the project that I work on, the Homer multi-text, we have decided that we didn't want to privilege one text over the others. So we just wanted to go historically. Like, we present each historical text. We don't amend it. We don't make it prettier. We don't fix mistakes. We just transmit the historical documents. But the idea of multiformity, the idea of a text that's always in flux, is already there in the ancient text. I'm not going to go into great detail, but when song is described in the Iliad and in the Odyssey, there's definitely a conveyance there through metaphor or through the words themselves that show that there's an awareness that this is a living, dynamic tradition, and that's always in flux. And so you can't make it static and one. So if you're interested in this topic, I have two publications, well, lots, but I have two publications that are online, freely accessible, and could easily be read by students. And I write for students when I write. So one is a book called Achilles Unbound, which is a book about how the Iliad has come down to us, and also what are the poetic implications of that. How does it change our understanding that this is an oral poem? How do the poetics differ from a poem that was composed in writing? And then also, I also have this article in an online journal called Ancient Exchanges. It's the first issue of a new journal called Ancient Exchanges that I have an essay about. It's called Performance Song, Translating an Oral Traditional Epic. And it includes a translation of Iliad 1 with first book of the Iliad with sort of from a point of view of oral poetry, like how you would convey it as oral poetry. And and then there's an essay accompanying it to explain all the choices. So if you're interested in these topics, I highly encourage you to look these up. I mean, like I say, they're, it's my stuff, so obviously I think it's good, but no. No, I mean, it is accessible and meant for students, freely available. So they go into much, much more detail than I was able to do today. But now I would like to move on and turn things over to my colleagues.